half of the 16th century. The numbers of robed nobility exhibited a particularly spectacular increase, but sword nobility numbers also increased substantially. In rural areas, such as the Bayeux region, the proportion of sword to robe nobles stayed roughly constant. How was this enormous expansion of nobility accomplished? The change in the number of nobles was determined by two processes: the natural increase in established noble families and the appearance of new nobles, nobles, resulting from upward mobility. Table 5.3, the column labeled Growth Rate, gives the rate of change in the number of established noble families in the Bayeux region. For most time periods, the number of established families shrank as a result of fail. You're in the male line, emigration from the region, or loss of the noble status. In only one period, 1540 to 98, did the natural increase resulting from family E, AR, Li, Mo, DRN, FR, and CE 161. Splitting, when the family patrimony is split between two or more sons, each of whom establishes a separate nuclear family, overwhelm the forces reducing the number of old nobility. These dynamics are illustrated by the numbers of ancient nobility, those who were ennobled prior to 1463, which showed a decline from 1463 to 1540, an increase to 1598, and thereafter another decline. Table 5.3. The 16th century was the period of the greatest upward mobility. Because the majority of new nobles appearing in the Bayeux region were actually old nobles immigrating from elsewhere to study upward mobility, we need to focus on individuals who were elevated from commoner status to noble status, the annobles. The social origins of the newly ennobled were quite diverse, but the main requirement for obtaining and preserving noble status was wealth, usually based on owning land, office, or both. Thus, families entering the nobility were already a part of the elite, or elite aspirants. Table 5.3 indicates that the dynamics of upward mobility largely paralleled those of already established nobility. The rate of appearance of annobles grew throughout the 16th century, reaching a peak in 1540 to 98, then collapsed in the 17th century, Table 5.3. Thus, the period 1540 to 98 was particularly favorable to the survival and multiplication not only of the old noble families, but also of upwardly mobile commoners. A more precise, in the sense of having better temporal resolution, look at the dynamics of upward mobility can be gained by examining the numbers of ennoblements that were registered with the Chambre des Comptes in Paris, figure 5.5. It is clear that the greatest influx of new nobles did not occur uniformly during the period 1540 to 98, but toward the end of the century, during the wars of religion. This correlation between civil war and the rate of ennoblements is not a spurious one, since all three peaks of ennoblement, 1350 to 1410, 1570 to 1600, and 1640 to 60, occurred during periods of high socio-political instability. Elite incomes and wealth. Why did the elites, both established and aspirants, do so well during the 16th century? The main requirement for upward mobility during this period was possession of sufficient wealth. Nobility was essentially open to any wealthy family if it was willing to play by the rules and be patient. Strategies for achieving noble status included purchasing land, preferably a fief, acquiring offices, marrying well, and sending sons to the university or into military service. The economic situation for elites and elite aspirants was also good during the middle part of the 16th century. The main engine of elite prosperity was the growth of income from agriculture. Landed revenues of a number of Norman seigneuries are known, and they show similar Chapter 5, 162. Figure 5.5 ennoblements in France, 1350 to 1660, Schalk 1982. Trajectories. For example, the receipts of the county of Tancarville coal lapsed during the first half of the 15th century, then enjoyed a mild recovery to 1510, followed by more rapid growth to the 1540s, Bois 1984, 257. The total income of the Roncherol family also collapsed during the 15th century. Between 1480 and 1520, the nominal revenue increased. Its real value when measured in grain stagnated, but grew when measured in chicken equivalents. Between 1520 and 1570, however, revenues grew rapidly in terms of both grain and poultry, DeWald 1987:234. In the 17th century, revenues stagnated. The estate of Saussay, belonging to the Maynard family of wealthy Rouen magistrates, provides another illustration of the same pattern. Table 5.5. There was little movement between 1480 and 1520. The great jump in real revenues came between 1520 and 1560. After 1575, revenues declined as a result of the economic troubles of tenants. A doubling of income in grain equivalents, however, was an unusually good showing. The responses of estates to the changing economic circumstances of the 16th century showed great diversity. Losses to inflation were serious on some estates held by the robe nobility of Rouen, especially on those whose enfiefed domains were leased by money rents. Dewald, 1980, 208. Most typical were estates such as Bec-Crespin, belonging to the Rome family. In the years 1517 to 29, all Bec-Crespin revenues, including the domain and enfiefed domain, were leased for 667 livres per year, EARLYMODERNFRANCE 163. Table 5.5. Total rent Saucy. Rent in mines. Date of wheat 148 392 1522 99 156 6174 157 518 1158 316 8158 915 015 9472. Source Dewald 1980 212. Around 350 hectolitres of grain at the Paris prices. The enfiefed domain alone was leased for 2,075 livres, 340 hectolitres of grain, in 1604 and 3,150 livres, 350 hectolitres, in 1605 1,638. In other words, the total revenue in real terms increased between 1520 and 1600, since this number does not include the revenues from the domain and then stayed constant during the first half of the 17th century. Those Norman estates that could be followed were in much the same situation as Bec-Crespin, Dewald 1980 208. In some, during the half-century after 1520, that is, during the stagflation phase of the Valois cycle, average revenues from land at least kept pace with the price of grain, and on many estates grew in real terms. The most likely explanation for this pattern is the overpopulation during this period, which drove down real wages and pushed up real rents. Yearly income from office also increased at a rapid pace. Between 1520 and 1610, fees charged by the magistrates of Rouen increased eightfold. Dewald 1980, 158. The growth in annual incomes and the total wealth of many Rouen magistrates can be followed by examining the probate records and account books. During the 16th century, the typical income of a Rouen parlementaire grew tenfold, from 500 to 5,000 livres, table 5.6. In real terms, income more than doubled by the 1540s, then fell slightly as the 1580s approached. It is also interesting to follow the combined incomes of the magistrates as an estimate of what their cost was to the society as a whole. The combined income continued to expand throughout the whole period, table 5.6. This is an interesting and significant pattern. Although the total income of all Rouen parlementaires increased substantially between the 1540s and the 1570s to 1580s, the number of magistrates doubled, resulting in a decrease in per capita income. We can check these results by looking at the salaries of office holders in Montpellier. Greengrass 1985 122. The data are not strictly comparable because for Rouen's magistrates we have estimates of total income, which is a better measure of their economic well-being, while for Montpellier, see HAPT ER 5164. Table 5.6 Incomes of Parlementaires of Rouen, 1500 to 1600. Combined period numbers. Income, LT. Price of wheat income, HL. Income, HL. 1500s, 35, 500 0.99, 503, 17,000, 650, 20s 35, 1,001.86 537, 18,000, 840 20s, 35, 2,502.27, 1,102, 38,000, 657, 285,000, 664, 753, 49,700. Source, Dewald, 1980. Note, units, LT, livre tournois, HL, hectolitre. Table 5.7, salaries of royal officers in Montpellier, 1500 to 1600. Combined adjusted for average period numbers salaries, LT, inflation A, LT, real salary, LT, 1,500, 112, 14,885, 59,532, 1,550, 125, 33,000, 366,734, 1,575, 257,000, 67,000, 52,667,000, 267, 1,642, 256,791, 184,890, 118. Source Irvine, 1979, cited in Greengrass, 1885, Table 6.1. Salaries are adjusted for inflation, taking the year 1575 as a base. The data refer to salaries with which the officials were, theoretically, remunerated. Furthermore, the Rouen data are for a particularly privileged stratum of the provincial robe nobility. Nevertheless, some patterns are shared by both datasets, Table 5.7. In particular, there was a great expansion of official numbers, as well as of their cost to society, in real terms. Second, the particularly rapid expansion of numbers of officials came during the third quarter of the 16th century, when their numbers doubled at both Rouen and Montpellier, and this numerical expansion was accompanied by a drop in the average income or salary. It would be very interesting to examine the dynamics of the incomes of other segments of the nobility, but unfortunately direct data for such an investigation are lacking. Dewald, however, was able to obtain a glimpse by examining marriage contracts, which provide an approximate idea of the relative wealth of different groups. Between the first half of the 16th century and around 1600, the median dowry in parlementaire marriages increased sixfold, Table 5.8. Recollect that the annual income increased by about the same order of magnitude, from 1,000 to 5,000 livres, Table 5.6. The dowries of lesser gentry, écuyers, on the other hand, increased only twofold, while the growth of dowries in lawyer, avocats, mariages was intermediate between those of lesser gentry and parlementaires, ER Limodiarn, far in c. 165. Table 5.8 Dowries in Normandy, 1500 to 1614. Median dowries, LT. Social stratum 1,500 to 1,550, 1,568 to 1,614. Lesser gentry 1,300, 22,625 lawyers, 1,375, 5,368 parliamentarians, 4,500, 27,000. Source: Dewald, 1980, 128 to 29. Table 5.8. During the same period, wheat prices increased about fourfold. In other words, the lesser gentry were losing ground, the parlementaires were getting ahead, and the lawyers were just breaking even, or perhaps slightly slipping. Compression of the elites. The basic problem facing the nobility was the irreconcilable contradiction between two processes. Total production stagnated after 1540, and even declined toward the end of the century, while the numbers of the elites grew inexorably. One result of this dynamic was increasing exploitation of peas ants, but there were biological limits on how low the standard of living of the productive class could be driven. The second consequence, therefore, was the lower real income per elite capita. This does not mean that all elite families suffered equally. On the contrary, the basic dynamic, at least for a while, was for the rich to get richer, while the poor got poorer. This is typical of the stagflation and crisis phases of secular cycles. Thus, the real income of the lesser gentry was declining by 1600, while the privileged segment of the robe nobility, the parlementaire, was growing more wealthy. Within the parlementaire stratum, however, the same basic dynamic was also operating. Between 1499 and 1600, the numbers of parlementaires grew from 35 to 83, Table 5.4. The proximate reason for this growth was the Crown's fiscal difficulties, which were partially solved by a periodic sale of newly established venal offices. But it is also important to recognize that such offices were in great demand. In fact, as the number of venal offices was expanded, their price rose at a spectacular rate. Doyle, 1996, 11. A councillorship in the Parlement of Rouen sold for less than 5,000 livres in the 1570s, 10,000 livres tournois in the 1580s, and 20,000 livres tournois in the 1600s. It doubled again by 1615, Yet again by 1634 and by the 1670s it had reached the highest point for office prices in the Parlement when it was evaluated at 88,000 livres tournois. About half of the rise was due to inflation, but most, an almost tenfold increase in real terms, was driven by an intense intra-elite competition. Economically, this increase, CHAPTER 5166. Table 5.9 Average Dowries LT of Major Governors 1493 to 1663. Social stratum 1493 to 1560, 1560 to 1605, 1605 to 1663. Major Governors 90,000, 460,000. Source Harding 1978:114. In the cost of the office did not make sense. The offices were valued for their extra economic value, status. This interpretation is confirmed by the growing price of the seigneuries, fiefs, another kind of property sought primarily for its extra economic value. This inflation of fief values is indicated by the steadily decreasing returns on seigneurial property. From 10% in the early 16th century, 1507, to 4 to 4.5% in 1563 to 97. 3.3% in 1601, and 2.2% in 1627. Dewald, 1980, 203. The rising costs of office, coupled with the rising costs of education, Dewald 1980, 135 to 36, had dramatic effects on the economics of vice holding. Until about 1570 offices were sold for prices corresponding to the economic returns they offered. After the great office inflation of 1570 to 1630, offices were bought for prestige or the political importance they offered. Dewald 1980, 143. By 1610, the chances of creating a new fortune from the profits of office had become very small. Dewald 1980, 160. Whereas office holding was one of the routes for upward mobility during the 16th century, the magistrate stratum became increasingly closed after 1600. The situation in Rouen mirrored more general developments in France as a whole. Prior to 1600, merchant families often moved directly into royal courts by buying an office in a chamber of AC counts, or even a parlement for their sons. After 1600, this mechanism for social mobility to the highest levels of the robe slowed down, and 2 or 3 generations of royal office, each one more exalted than the last, were generally required. Collins, 1995-41. The 17th century tendency of slower upward mobility is reflected in the social origin of the members of Parlement. In the mid-16th century, only 20% of them were sons of high officials. A century later, 60% followed in their father's footsteps. Table 5.10. The 17th century, thus, was a period of retrenchment for the robe nobility of Rouen. Their numbers essentially ceased to grow. Table 5.4. And upward mobility into their ranks was practically choked off. A similar pattern was observed for the rural nobility of Bayeux. The rate of appearance of noblesse families reached a peak of 1.3 families per year during 1540 to 98, then dropped off to 0.2 to 0.7 families per year during the first 2/3 of the 17th century. Table 5.3. At the same time, resistance to accepting the nobility of upwardly mobile families intensified, whereas Dur EAR li mot d'RN Fren CE 167. Table 5.10 Social origins of parlementaire. Proportion percent who were sons of lawyers and time period, high officials, lesser officials, noblemen, bourgeois. 1 539-58231889 1559-782210157159-8822811 6 41589-9826 2461599-1618 4711 13716193 Source Dewald 1980. In the 16th century, only 1.4 to 1.6% of families pretending to the noble status were condemned, denied the noble status. This proportion rose to 3.2% during the first half of the 17th century and to 6% during the second half. Table 5.2. Note the cyclic return of the proportion condemned to the previous peak during the 15th century. 6.2% in 1462, another period of nobility compression. At the same time that upward mobility into the ranks of nobility was choked off, the size of the group of elite aspirants apparently shrank. As we mentioned earlier, one of the routes to noble status was the acquisition of a noble fief, seigneury. Since the proportion of fiefs held by commoners is known, we can use it to obtain an idea of the size of the upwardly mobile stratum. The proportion of income from fiefs held by commoners increased from 8% in 1552 to 13% in 1587, and then declined to 2% in 1687, 1640, Wood, 1981-47. In other words, during the second half of the 16th century, the pool of elite aspirants grew, whereas during the first half of the 17th century, it shrank to almost zero. During the same period, the proportion of fiefs, by value, held by the old nobility increased from 52% to 72%, while the proportion held by new nobility declined from 17% to 12%. What apparently happened was that elite aspirants converted their holdings of fiefs into noble status during the 16th century and the early 17th century. As upward mobility dropped off after 1600, the descendants of the former elite aspirants became first new nobles and then old nobles. While the proportion of old nobility among the landed elites increased, the total numbers of rural nobles in Normandy probably declined toward 1700. We do not have the data for the Bayeux region, but in another rural election, that of Gisors, there were 74 noble households out of the total of 7,500 in 1703, or about 1% of the population. See HAPTER 5, 168. Table 5.11, Distribution percent of annual revenues of noble families in the Bayeux region in 1639 and 1666. Income bracket, LT, 1,639 to 1,666. Less than 1,067.4, 49.6, 1,000 to 10,000, 29.1, 48.0, more than 10,000 Source, Wood, 1980, 128. DeWald, 1987:91. In the election of Rouen, excluding the city of Rouen, there were only 154 rural noble families out of population of 17,514, or less than 1%, in 1703. However, the regional capital was the home of additional 272 noble households and about 160 families of high royal officials. DeWald, 1987-91. Whereas the second half of the 16th century saw an erosion of incomes of the rural nobility, Table 5.8, this decline was stopped and even reversed sometime in the mid-17th century. We are fortunate to have data on income distribution among the nobility of the Bayeux region at 2 points in time, 1639 and 1666, Wood 1980, 127 to 128. Mean family income rose from 1400 to 1900 LT between the two dates. Since the real value of a livre was approximately the same at these two dates, this 34% increase in nominal terms represents a real increase in noble incomes. But an even more striking change occurred in the median income, from less than 400 LT to 1,000 LT, whereas more than two-thirds of nobles disposed of an income of less than 1,000 LT. By 1666, this proportion had declined to less than half, Table 5.11. The category including the richest nobles also declined slightly. It was the middle class that increased, reflecting the declining degree of wealth inequality. The purging of nobility of its poorest members continued during the first half of the 18th century. In the elections of Gisors and rural Rouen, excluding the city, the proportions of noble families with incomes of less than 1,000 LT declined to 46 and 41% in 1703 and to 11 and 16% in 1757 respectively, DeWald, 1987, 115. What was apparently happening was that poor nobles were dropping out of the ranks of nobility, while the number of better-off nobles, those with more than 1,000 LT of annual income, stabilized. Thus, in the rural Rouen region, there were 91 such nobles in 1703 and 88 in 1757, while in Gisors there were 40 such nobles in both 1702 and 1757, calculated from tables 32 and 33 in DeWald 1987. The proportion of impoverished nobles, however, began increasing again during the second half of the century, and on the Revolution's eve, 1788, the proportions of poor nobles increased to 26% and 17% in the two elections, Dewald 1987-115. EARLYMODERNFRANCE 169. Is there a general pattern underlying the material we have reviewed in this section? It appears so. The pattern is that the numbers, or more precisely, the noble to commoner ratio, and per capita wealth of nobility existed in a state of dynamical interrelation. A decline in the noble commoner ratio has a beneficial effect on noble incomes. Vice versa, increasing the number of nobles in relation to commoner numbers had a depressing effect on the mean incomes, and an even greater effect on the proportion of poor nobles. Incomes enjoyed by noble families also affected their numbers. This is a kind of feedback loop, because high incomes promoted family multiplication and upward mobility, while low incomes compressed nobility by squeezing out the poorest stratum. The system was not dynamically closed, however, because it was affected by such factors, which themselves vary with the phase of the secular cycle, as commoner numbers, for example, high commoner numbers drive up rents and depress wages, benefiting the elites, and socio-political instability. On the one hand, civil wars sped up the ennoblement rate of elite aspirants, but on the other hand, they elevated mortality, especially for young males. One overall effect of civil wars, thus, is a diminishing pool of elite aspirants, wealthy commoners and the younger sons of nobility, resulting in a perhaps temporary relief of the social pressure. 5.6 Depression, 1660 to 1660. Diverging population trends between North and South. Different regions of France exhibited significant variations in their demographic trajectories. France is a large and diverse country, and its many regions would not be expected to oscillate in synchrony. We can trace the divergent trajectories of regions using the data on tithes, demography, and the incidence of internal warfare. The main distinction we focus on here is that between the French-speaking North and the Occitan-speaking South. Secondary divisions of interest are the ethnic fringes of northern France, namely Brittany, Flanders, and above all Alsace, which at that time was much more in the orbit of German rather than French politics. The tithe records discussed by Leroy-Ladurie indicate that both the South and the North followed trajectories of the same shape, which, however, were shifted with respect to each other by 20 years. The 15th century's minimum in the South occurred between 1400 and 1430, and the expansion took off between 1430 and 1450. In the North, the minimum occurred during the 1440s, and the expansion started only after 1450, probably as a result of a lag in the incidence of war-caused disasters. Leroy CHAPTER 5, 17-0. Ladurie 1987, 44 a 45. A century later, the South was the first to achieve the maximum, around 1540, and thereafter production stayed flat to 1560. In the North, the maximum was achieved 20 years later. The South was again the first to be affected by the devastation of the wars of religion. The documents on the sale of church property support the tithe records and indicate that by 1568 there was a red zone of maximum damage centered on Poitou, Aquitaine, and Languedoc. This is where religious conflicts were the most intense and where the productive capacity was most seriously undermined by the conflict. By 1583, the worst affected zones were again in the Occitanian heartland: Aquitaine, Gascony, Languedoc, Rouergue, Auvergne, and Dauphine. During the 1590s, the war spread to the north. Normandy, Ile-de-France, Picardy, and Champagne were all affected by the final convulsions of the Catholic League. However, the South was also subjected to continuing damage. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:251. Tithe records show 3 bad periods for Languedoc and the Mediterranean South. The first production fall, 36%, occurred right after the outbreak of war in 1560. The second wave hit during the 1570s, when production was 43% less than the pre-war level, 1532 to 50. The third difficult period was between 1583 and 1596, when the average delivery of tithes was 36% below the pre-war level. Leroy-Ladurie, 1987, 263. The adjacent regions were affected almost as badly. Auvergne lost 35 to 40% of its productive capacity, and Lyonnais lost 40%. The French north also experienced a significant drop in production, but it did not occur until the 1590s, and generally there was less devastation than in the south. Overall, the regions in the north lost 33%, while the Paris region lost only 20 to 25%, 25% in tithes and 16% in rents. Eastern France was similar to the south with respect to the depth of the fall, but the timing of the collapse was the same as in the north. Thus, in Burgundy, the net product of tithes in kind fell spectacularly between 1588 and 1600. Grain tithes during these 12 years fell 43% in relation to the prosperous period of 1550 to 68, Le Roi Ladurie 1987, 262 minus 63. Finally, the least affected region in the 16th century was Alsace, where the net product of tithes fell only 7.3%, Le Roi Ladurie 1987, 265. During the 17th century, the trajectories of different regions continued to diverge, and the parallelism was lost. The Mediterranean South seems to have escaped the economic and demographic catastrophes of the mid-17th century, Le Roi Ladurie, 1987, 278. The tithes there expanded from the minimum of the 1580s until the 1670s, after which they again declined, figure 5.6. In fact, the South entered a period of long-term population decline that lasted from 1680 to 1740 or even 1750. Le Roi Ladurie, 1974, 295, 317. EARLYMO DERNFRANCE 171. Figure 5.6, diverging trajectories in northern and southern France, mid-1500s to mid-1700s. A. Revenues from Gabelle de France, Le Roi Ladurie 1987, 388, reflecting economic conditions in the north. B. Tithes in the south, Le Roi Ladurie and Goy 1982. In the north, there also was a recovery after the catastrophe of the 1590s, but in contrast to the south, the recovery was short-lived. The extreme northeast and north of the kingdom was affected by the fighting during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48. Thus, in Alsace, not a part of France at that time, but we have good data on production there, grain tithes collapsed to less than 10% of their peak value, Le Roi Ladurie and Goy 1982. Even after the peace, during the 1650s, production was only 30% of that in 1620. Northern regions such as Cambresis were also devastated by military operations between the French and Spanish. Then came the Fronde, which was particularly devastating in the central regions CHAPTER 517-2 of the kingdom. Thus, the curve of tithe yields around Beaune from 1500 to 1790 shows lows around 1590 and again from 1640 to 1660, followed by a rise from 1660 to 1720, Benedict 1985-86. In Languedoc and the Mediterranean South, tithes in kind recovered during the early 17th century, and the curve then flattens out around 1640. However, the tithes did not completely regain their level of the mid-16th century. They were perhaps 5% below. In Auvergne, production remained 15% below the 16th century peak, in Burgundy 13% below, and in the Lyonnais tithes also stagnated except in the region around Lyons. Overall, the tithe records suggest that the productive capacity of the kingdom recovered during the early 17th century but did not exceed the previously achieved level of the mid-16th century. The major exception to this pattern was the region around Paris, which apparently exceeded the 16th century level. Thus, the net product in rents, in kind, from the estates of Notre-Dame de Paris increased to 44% above the previous peak in the 1580s, Le Roi Ladurie, 1987, 302. However, it is hard to decide how much of this increase was due to greater production and how much to greater exploitation of peasants. Growth of top fortunes. The dynamics of the top fortunes often provide a useful indicator about fluctuations in the economic inequality. The largest private fortune of 17th century France belonged, without a doubt, to Jules Mazarin, the notorious prime minister during the minority years of Louis XIV. Ministerial fortunes went on a dizzying roller coaster ride during the 17th century. Henri IV's minister Sully, who was forced to resign his position in 1610, gained a fortune estimated at his death as 5.2 million livres, Barbiche 1978. On his death in 1642, Richelieu left his heirs a fortune of 22 million livres, Bonny 1999 127. This was a tremendous amount of wealth, but it was bettered by Mazarin, who left a fortune of 37 million livres to his heirs, Bonny 1999 27. This was a particularly striking achievement because it was accomplished in 8 years. Between 1653, Mazarin lost most of his previous wealth during the Fronde of 1648 to 53, and his death in 1661. Second echelon ministers also did extremely well. Claude Bouillon, Richelieu's finance minister, 1632 to 40, gained a fortune of 7.8 million livres in just 8 years of office. Nicolas Fouquet's assets were evaluated in excess of 15.4 million livres at the time of his arrest in 1661, although his debts equaled his assets. To place these numbers in perspective, we can compare them to what is known about the fortunes of the greatest noble houses. The fortune of EARLYMODERNFRANCE 173. One branch of the Bourbons, closely related to the king, the Princes de Conti, was 12 million livres in 1655 to 65, and then declined to 7.6 million during the 1670s, Mughel 1971. Louis Gonzague's Duc de Nevers left an inheritance of 8 million, which was, however, encumbered by debts totaling 2.5 million, Harding 1978. The wealthiest noble house was probably that of the Princes de Condé. Its total fortune in the early 18th century, shared among several branches, was estimated as 31 million livres, Roche 1967. The scale of private gains by ministers from public office began to be brought under control during the reign of Louis XIV. Colbert's wealth was estimated at between 4.95 and 5.75 million, probably closer to the high end. Louvois gained a fortune of some 8 million in a career spanning 2 decades, 1672 to 91. After 1720, ministerial gains from office were small beer indeed compared to the situation before 1661, Bonny 1999 127, reversal of the disintegrative trend. It is clear that the assumption of personal rule by Louis XIV in 1661 marked an important turning point in the history of France. The most dramatic development was the consolidation of the elites around the centre, which ended the intralite conflict that had plagued the preceding Hun, dread years, and channeled elite energies into wars of external conquest. The internal workings of how this consensus between the elites and the state was achieved has been admirably probed by William Bike, 1985-2005, using as an example the provincial aristocracy of Languedoc, essentially the last period of high socio-political instability, peaking with the Fronde of 1648 to 53, forced the elites to understand that they needed military, diplomatic, and economic protection of the centre. Bake 1985, 331. Between 1560 and 1660, various factions fighting in civil wars were either entirely composed of the elites or were elite-mobilized popular uprisings. After 1660, the elites withdrew their leadership and uprisings dramatically declined. Bake 1985-12. Later, popular uprisings, such as the rebellion of Cévennes peasants, 1702-4, lacked support among the elites and were easily put down. The new consensus allowed the government of Louis XIV to raise taxes to an unprecedented level in French history, see Figure 5.2. The elites were, of course, the primary beneficiaries. First, the comparative distribution of tax flow between crown and regional elites in 1647 and 1677, Bike, 1985, 267, shows that at least in Languedoc, the regional elites were able to increase the share of taxes that remained in the province. Second, the lion's share of taxes went toward financing the wars of Louis XIV, which meant Chapter 5, 174. Improved employment for the sword nobility. Furthermore, at least during the late 17th century, Louis's program of external conquest was highly successful. The consolidation of the elites and re-establishment of law and order, however, did not immediately end the regime of population stagnation, since sustained demographic expansion began only after 1720. Real wages continued to increase until the 1680s, see Figure 5.1, although even at its peak, the real wage was less than half that of the golden age of the early 15th century. Agricultural wages exhumed by Jacquard and discussed by Leroy-Ladurie, 1987:352, followed the same general pattern, at least around Paris. The 2 decades around 1700 saw another substantial population decline, although the determining, or at least a very important contributing factor, appears to be worsening of the climate. A sustained period of population growth began only after 1719 and lasted to 1790, Dupaquier et al. 1988 Thus, although the elite and state dynamics turned a corner around 1660, the demographic and economic trends indicated continuing stagnation to the end of the century. This appears to be an example of how real-life dynamics may not fit the neat division of the secular cycle into phases. 5.7 Conclusion. In many ways, the Valois cycle, 1450 to 1660, is another textbook example of demographic structural mechanisms in action. We are lucky in that the historical record is good enough for us to test many mechanisms postulated by the theory with concrete and detailed historical data, and that this period attracted the attention of such giants as Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. These processes include the Malthusian effects of population growth, and how population growth and elite overproduction causes state breakdown. The case study of Norman nobility has thrown a lot of light on how elite overproduction develops, and what consequences it has for the elites themselves as well as for other components of the social system. In his path-breaking work, Jack Goldstone, 1991, did not discuss in any significant way the preconditions of the French Wars of Religion, although he devoted some space to a later conflict, the Fronde. Yet what happened in France from 1559 on matches very well the patterns he discerned in his study of other state collapses, the financial ruin of the state, its loss of control over the military, intensifying intralite factionalism and competition, and finally full-blown civil war. There were also some complexities of the interplay among different variables, mainly dealing with the demographic and economic dynamics of the early modern France 175. Commoner population during the late 17th century. Although we use 1660 as the end of the cycle, an argument can be made that the Depression phase lasted to the end of the century. We think that the demographic structural theory is an extremely useful tool for understanding historical dynamics, but history is complex, and we should not expect all of it to fit into a single neat scheme. Chapter 6. Rome, the Republican Cycle, 350 to 30 BCE. 6.1 Overview of the cycle. A secular cycle during the regal early Republic period. Although the fragmentary nature of sources allows us at most a hypothetical reconstruction of the economic and social dynamics of Rome during the regal and early Republic periods, we believe a case can be made that between 650 and 350 BCE, the Roman polity went through a complete secular cycle, with the integrative trend dominating before 500 BCE and the disintegrative trend holding until the early 4th century. Some evidence for this thesis comes from the cyclic dynamics of public building activity. The first peak came around 500 BCE, while the second occurred during the Middle Republic, figure 6.1. More important, during the 5th century BCE, Rome went through a period of heightened socio-political instability, figure 6.2, typical of the disintegrative phases of secular cycles. The saw-toothed pattern in the curve probably arises as a result of the operation of fathers and sons cycles. Sorokin's time series is sampled at quarter-century intervals, and therefore cycles with average periods of 50 years show up as alternating high and low values. The period of internal instability began in Rome in 509 BCE with the overthrow of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and the establishment of the Republic. Most of the 5th century and the early part of the 4th century were dominated by the conflict of the orders, a struggle between the elites and commoners, as well as between different factions of elites. Rafflaub, 1986, Cornell, 1995, Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 66. Two issues were at the center of the political controversy. One was the disposition of the public land. In the period from 486 to 367, there were 25 separate attempts made by the plebeians to have public land, especially newly conquered areas, redistributed in allotments to the citizens. Cornell, 1995, 270. The second issue was alleviation of debt burden. However, it is important to recognize that the plebeians were not a homogeneous social group. Whereas the majority of plebeians were motivated by these two issues, land and debt, the socially prominent and wealthy among them aimed at social and political equality with the patricians. They demanded that intermarriage between patricians and plebeians be officially permitted. R-O-M-E, T-H-E-R-E-P-U-B-L-I-C-A-N-C-Y-C-L-E 177. Figure 6.1 Temporal distribution of temple building activity in Rome, circa 600 to 50 BCE. Data from Richardson, 1992. Figure 6.2 An index of socio-political instability in Republican Rome, Sorokin, 1937. CHAPTER 6178. And they wanted plebeians to be eligible for magistracies and priesthoods. Von Ungern-Sternberg, 1986:354. The leaders of the plebeian movement were thus ambitious individuals from well-to-do families who wanted their share of the power. Cornell, 1995, 291, and who used the economic concerns of the commoners to mobilize political support for their political struggle against the patricians. The conflict between the patricians and the wealthy plebeians was ended by the enactment of the Licino-Sextian laws of 367, which transformed the political structure of the Roman state by ending all forms of discrimination against plebeians. Cornell, 1995, 340. The legislation created the conditions for merging the established and aspirant elites. Without major difficulties, therefore, they, plebeians, melted into a new social and political elite, the nobility, already in the second half of the 4th century. Von Ungern-Sternberg, 1986, 355. Phases of the Republican cycle. The achievement of internal unity among the elites following the Licino. Sextian Compromise of 367 marked the shift from the disintegrative to integrative trends, and opened the long and highly successful period of Rome's territorial expansion. By the end of the 4th century BCE, Latium and Campania had merged together into a Roman Campanian state, which involved agreement between the Roman and Capuan aristocracies to create a shared army. The great Capuan families were welcomed into the Roman Senate, Legle et al. 1997. Internal unity created conditions for territorial expansion, which resulted in Rome first establishing control over peninsular Italy, and then acquiring a Mediterranean empire. During the 3rd century BCE, Rome had to fight a series of prolonged and bitter wars. The Second Punic War was particularly destructive, that delivered several shocks to population growth. Growth resumed after the end of the war with Hannibal, 218 to 201, and Rome entered the stagflation phase around 180 BCE. There was no sharp transition between the stagflation and the crisis phase. Between 133 and 91 BCE, Roman society slipped into crisis by stages. The first wave of severe instability was the series of civil wars between 90 and 71. It was followed by a relatively peaceful interlude in the 60s and 50s, and then the second series of civil wars from 50 to 31 BCE, which finally produced conditions for the reversal of the disintegrative trend. We use the end of the civil wars and the establishment of the Principate by Augustus as the end point of the Roman Republican cycle. Therefore, the disintegrative trend combining crisis and depression phases is dated by us as the century between 130 and 30 BCE. In the 1st century BCE, thus, the state and society of Rome were fundamentally transformed. The proximate factors leading to the collapse of the Republic and the establishment of the Principate with a series of civil R-O-M-E-T-H-E-R-E-P-U-B-L-I-C-A-N-C-Y-C-L-E 179. Figure 6.3 Numbers of Roman citizens 400 to 100 BCE, Toynbee 1965, 438 to 39. Wars that afflicted Italy during this century. Why Rome experienced this period of social and political instability, however, does not yet have a widely accepted answer. Probably the most influential model explaining this period is the one advanced by Keith Hopkins, 1978. We offer an explanation based on the demographic structural theory that in some parts coincides with Hopkins's model and in other parts diverges from it. Although we do not necessarily agree with all aspects of Hopkins's model, We are indebted to his pioneering effort. Population dynamics. We are lucky to have the census numbers for the Roman Republican period, transmitted by the annalists. The consensus among the Roman historians appears to be that these numbers can serve as a reasonably solid basis for reconstructing the dynamics of the Roman population. Scheidel 2001, 2004. The numbers refer not to the total population, but only to adult free males. The overall trend between 350 and 100 BCE was growth, which was interrupted by several sharp declines. Figure 6.3. Population decreases core relate with periods of very intense warfare, the First and Second Punic Wars, 264 to 241 and 218 to 201, respectively. What we really wish to know, however, is not how the numbers of Roman citizens changed, but what happened to the total population of CHA PTER 6180, Peninsular Italy. The censuses cannot be taken as an index of total population, because they increased not only as a result of demographic growth, but also when free inhabitants of certain annexed territories were admitted to Roman citizenship. There was a particularly massive enfranchisement of Italian allies following the Social War. Additionally, the Italian population was swelled by huge influxes of slaves from outside the peninsula, which became an increasingly significant factor as Rome's conquest of Mediterranean proceeded. Population trends during the late Republic early Principate period have been debated at length by demographers and economic historians. The main controversy has to do with the interpretation of the Augustan censuses. The proponents of the high count, Frank 1933, Lo Cascio 1994, Morley 2001, assume that the census numbers represent adult free males, while the proponents of the low count, Belloch 1886, Brunt 1971, believe that the numbers represent all free inhabitants of both sexes, with the possible exception of infants less than 1 year old. Here we follow Walter Scheidel, 2001 Adsanis, 2004-2007, who accepts the Belloch-Brunt reconstruction and refer the reader to his 2004 work for details of the argument. Brunt, 1971, concluded that the free population of Peninsular Italy numbered around 3 million in both 225 and 28 BCE. These numbers are accepted by Scheidel with only minor variations. Hopkins, 1978:68-69, also working with Brunt's numbers, argued that the population of the whole of Italy, including Cisalpine Gaul, declined between 225 and 28 BCE from 4.5 million to 4 million. However, Hopkins assumed that in 225 there were 1.4 million inhabitants in northern Italy, Cisalpine Gaul, and there are reasons to believe this figure is an overestimate. Delict 2004, 733. Because very little is known about northern Italy, it seems safer to stick with the numbers for Peninsular Italy alone. The apparent stability suggested by roughly the same population size in 225 and 28 BCE, however, is deceptive. In fact, these estimates serve to anchor a secular population cycle that Italy experienced in the last 2 centuries BCE. The cycle occurred in 3 phases. To come up with quantitative estimates of change, we follow Brunt's corrected census returns, his Table 7, and then use these Roman censuses as indicators of what was happening to the rest of the population in Italian peninsula. When we cite census statistics below, we round them to the nearest 1,000. In the first phase, between 225 and 200 BCE, the population declined as a result of prolonged and destructive Hannibalic War, Toynbee 1965. The magnitude of this decline is suggested by the census numbers during this period, from 273,000 in 225 to 214,000 in 203. In 208 and 194, the numbers were 137,000 and 140,000 respectively, but Brunt convincingly argues that these very low counts represent either the stationing of large numbers of troops abroad or deficient census procedures, or both. In Pro Rome, THEREPUBLICANCYCLE 181. Proportionate terms, the decline is 22%, so let us say that the total free population declined from 3 to 2.35 million. In the next phase, the 2nd century BCE, the population increased. Brunt accepts the censuses of 168, 313,000, and 124, 395,000, as reliable. Estimating population growth between 203 and 168 is a bit involved, B. Cause, according to Brunt, 26,000 Campanians, who switched sides in the Hannibalic War, were not counted in 203, but were included in 168. Taking this factor into account, he estimated the starting point population as 214,000 plus 26,000 equals 240,000. The ending population is estimated as 313,000 plus 33,000, the estimated number of soldiers stationed abroad, equals 346,000, or an increase of 44%. Thus, between 2003 and 1068, the Free Peninsula population increased from 2.35 to 3.39 million. In 124, the census was 395,000, to which Brunt adds 38,500 soldiers, for a total of 433,500. The change between 168 and 124 in proportionate terms thus is 25%. In other words, the free population in 124 was 4.25 million. In the last phase, the 1st century BCE, the population declined as a result of constant civil wars, a high urbanization index, and during later stages, massive state-sponsored population transfers. Brunt's calculations, based on the census of 69, suggest a population of 3.7 million. Brunt, 1971-97. Scheidel, 2004:9. Finally, by 28 BCE, the population had declined further to 3 million, returning to the level of 225. The reconstructed population dynamics are depicted in Figure 6.4. The graph in Figure 6.4 is somewhat deceptive. For one thing, it is overly smooth. In reality, each estimate comes with at least a 10% error. Second, the start of population decline probably occurred in the early 1st century, rather than right after 124. The census of 114 reported essentially the same numbers as in 124, and the population probably stagnated until the beginning of the Social War in 91. In 85, reported census numbers rose to 463,000. But this increase probably reflects a partial enumeration of newly enfranchised Italian allies. Brunt, 1971-93. Finally, all these numbers refer to the free population. The dynamics of the slave population are essentially inestimable. Scheidel, 2005. But by the end of the cycle, slave numbers probably reached 1 to 1.5 million. Thus, the total population, including both free and slave, decreased less during the 1st century than is shown by the graph, or even conceivably stayed flat. Social structure and elite dynamics. The top stratum, the magnates, of the Roman society during the Republican period was the senatorial order, Ordo Senatorius. Senators were the gov-earning class. They served as government officials, monopolized the chief priesthoods, and provided officers for the army. Cornell, 1995, Ward, CHAPTER 6182, Figure 6.4. Estimated numbers of the free population in Peninsular Italy from 225 to 28 BCE, based on data of Brunt, 1971, and calculations in the text. Heichelheim and Yeo, 2003. Senators came from both patrician and plebeian clans, gentes, and were wealthy landowners. The equestrians, equites, were lesser aristocrats, called equestrians B, because originally they served as cavalry in the army. This stratum provided many businessmen, merchants who conducted overseas commerce, and publicani who monopolized state contracts. In the late Republic, jury service was reserved for the equestrians. At the beginning of the cycle, circa 300 BCE, the majority of the commona population consisted of small landowners, citizens, and their familles. Citizens served as infantry, hoplites, in the army, and voted in the assembly of the arms-bearing males, Comitia Centuriata, and other popular assemblies that elected public officials. They were divided into 5 classes according to the value of their property, Table 6.1. The wealthier citizens, those with property valued above 100,000 asses in the equestrians, had more than half the votes, and therefore dominated elections. On the other hand, they also paid the bulk of the property tax, the tributum, Cornell, 1995, 187. The propertied citizens assidui were not poor. The third census class with property valued at 50,000 asses or more could not have been anything but medium-sized landholders. Rosenstein, 2004, 163. Anaz, around 200 BCE, weighed 2 Roman ounces of bronze. Its value was around 0.4 grams silver. On 2 occasions during the war with Hannibal, the Senate called for citizens in this census class to contribute 1 slave along with 6 ROME THEREP UBLICANCYCLE 183. Table 6.1 Wealth or annual income of various strata in the Roman Republic in the late 3rd century. Stratum income wealth notes: Senator 60,000 to 1 million. C note B, equestrian 24,000 to 400,000. Census qualification assiduous: 1 class 6,000 to 100,000. Census qualification assiduous: 2 class 4,500 to 75,000. Census qualification assiduous: 3 class 3,000 to 50,000. Census qualification assiduous: 4 class 1,500 to 25,000. Census qualification daily wage C 1,080. Crawford, 1974:624, 3 asses per diem. Assiduous: 5 class 750 to 12,500. Census qualification slave 100. Minimal subsistence assuming 3 asses per modius. Source: Cornell, 1995, 179 to 181. Note: valuations are given in asses. The as around 200 BCE weighed 2 Roman ounces of bronze and was valued at 0.1 denarius or 0.4 grams silver. Are incomes estimated from wealth, assuming that annual income equals 6% of wealth? B. The minimum wealth qualification was probably the same as for the equestrians, but senators were on average wealthier. In 214 BCE, those with property worth more than 1 million asses were required to supply 7 sailors for the fleet. Senators supplied 8, Mitchell, 1990, 247-78. So average senatorial property must have been more than 1 million asses. The equestrian senator proportion is also the same as in the Augustan census. See legionnaire pay, also probably the lowest daily salary paid by the state. Months of provisions as a rower in the fleet. Wealthier citizens were expected to contribute more. This suggests a degree of wealth well above the subsistence level. The lower strata of the Roman society included landless citizens, proletari, foreigners, freedmen, and slaves. The social structure during the Republic was very dynamic. Around 300 BCE, the bulk of the population was most likely the smallholders, assidui, while landless proletari were a minority. Brunt, 1971-77, thought that in 218, proletari amounted to half the citizen body. But as Rosenstein, 2004, 185, pointed out, this cannot be right. While proletarii did not serve in the army, they served as rowers in the fleet. In 214, at a time when there were no more than 20,000 proletarii serving in that capacity, the Senate was forced to recruit slaves as galley rowers. Brunt calculates that in 214, about 100,000 citizens were under arms or had been killed. Assuming similar military participation ratios, these numbers suggest that in the late 3rd century, the ratio of assidui to proletarii was roughly 10.2. Rosenstein, 2002, estimates that, in fact, about 90% of the citizenry were assidui because half of them, the older married men, were not drafted so that they could operate the farms. In the 3rd century, the ratio of wealthy landowners, equestrians and senators, to non-elite landholders, assidui, was just under 1 to 10, as suggested by the numbers of Roman cavalry and infantry in 225, reported by CHA PTER 6-184. Polybius, 23,000 and 250,000 respectively, the same proportion as in the regal period. Using this template together with the calculation in the previous paragraph, we arrive at the following breakdown of Roman social structure in mid-republic. Equites, including senators, assidui, proletari 1 to 10 to 2, or 1 to 10 to 1, if the Rosenstein estimate in the preceding paragraph is correct. To these categories, we need to add unknown numbers of slaves and foreigners. State finances. The basic demographic structural model was developed for states with approximately stationary territory. By contrast, the territory of Rome expanded from around 5,000 square kilometers in the 4th century BCE to more than 3 million square kilometers by the end of the 1st century BCE, Targapera, 1979. Such a spectacular 600-fold territorial expansion is a factor of enormous significance and must be added to the basic model described in Chapter 1. Territorial expansion helped solve the problem of landless citizens. It also affected how the Roman elites and the state secured their means of livelihood. Whereas in typical agrarian societies, the elites and the state extract surplus from the commoner population in the form of rents and taxes. In Republican Rome, the ruling class largely lived off the spoils of conquest. When the Third Macedonian War ended in 167 with a particularly large haul of booty, taxes levied on Italian land owned by Roman citizens were abolished. Hopkins, 1978:38. The land tax was not reimposed until the end of the 3rd century CE. The state took a cut of the booty resulting from the conquest and taxed conquered territories at the probable rate of 10% of the crop on average. Hopkins, 1978:16. As a result of Rome's success at war, the state revenues more than quadrupled during the 3rd century, Table 6.2. However, during the succeeding century, while the population and the numbers of elites expanded, the state revenues stagnated at the level of 55 to 80 million sesterces, Table 6.2. The main reason seems to be that after the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, Rome had simply run out of wealthy states to conquer. The endemic war against the Spanish guerrillas consumed men and treasure without yielding any significant booty. The next great leap of revenue expansion came only after the first round of civil wars. Socio-political instability. The 2 centuries between the last exit of the plebeians in 342 and the First Servile War, 135 to 132 BCE, were remarkably free of civil warfare. Table 6.3. By contrast, the century following the murder of Tiberius Gracchus was one of almost continuous internecine war. ROME THEREPUBLICANCYCLE 185. Table 6.2. State income. Millions of sesterces. HS. Date per year. Reference. 264 to 241 BCE 15 franc, 1933, 66 to 67. 218 to 201 BCE 65 franc, 1933, 95. 200 to 157 BCE 55 franc, 1933, 145. 150 to 90 BCE 80 franc, 1933, 228. Circa 65 BCE 200 Hopkins, 1978:37. Circa 60 BCE 340 Hopkins, 1978:37. 55 to 51 BCE 320 franc, 1933, 332, circa 50 BCE 380 A.D. Hall, 1996:54. This total probably includes the value of grain taxes of Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa. Michael Crawford, 1974, has argued that the deposition rate of coin hoards can serve as a faithful reflection of the conditions of internal instability affecting Italy during the Middle and Late Republic periods. Plotting Crawford data on coin hoards together with an index of internal warfare, we observe a remarkable degree of parallelism, figure 6.5. The two curves do not coincide in all the details, as is only natural when we deal with real data. For example, the coin hoard's trajectory has a minor peak in the 150s, and there were no significant internal disturbances during this decade. Crawford thought that these hoards could have been buried by legionnaires prior to leaving for and dying in external wars. Another possibility is that the peak in the 150s is simply a statistical fluctuation in the data. The period has only 8 hoards. The 3 major periods of internal war, on the other hand, are reflected in both curves: the Hannibalic Wars of the late 3rd century and the 2 civil wars of the 1st century. The 2nd century was relatively peaceful. There were few hordes and no significant internecine infighting during the first half, while rising horde deposits during the second half suggest growing socio-political tensions. 6.2. An unusually long expansion, 350 to 180 BCE. After the wars with the Samnites and Italian Greeks, the Roman state ended up with indirect control of peninsular Italy, with about 20% of territory in the Ager Romanus. The territorial expansion was accompanied by growth of the citizen body, Table 6.4. Cycles Peter 6186. Figure 6.5. Instability in Peninsular Italy, including Sicily, 220 to 0 BCE, as measured by two indices. 1. Incidence of coin hoards per decade, solid line, and 2. Proportion of years per decade in internal war, dashed line. Coin hoards from Crawford, 1993:162. Internal War Index is based on socio-political instability events listed in Table 6.2 plus the war with Hannibal, 218 to 201 BCE. If we can trust the census data, and the consensus among historians seems to be that we can, at least from the late 4th century onward, then the Roman population almost doubled between the mid-4th and mid-3rd centuries, while territory almost quintupled. As a result, the popular tie-in density actually declined, Table 6.4. This development explains to a large degree the alleviation of the land problem, which had plagued the Roman poor since the 5th century. The census numbers reflect not only, and perhaps even not primarily, demographic growth. Numbers of citizens were increased by the enfranchisement of the Latins and Campanians, while at the same time an estimated 70,000 Romans were lost to the citizen rolls as a result of colonization during the period 334 to 263, Cornell 1995-381. Population growth was also undoubtedly slowed by the series of intense wars that the Romans fought during the late 4th century, and all of the 3rd century against first the Samnites, then the Italian Greeks and Pyrrhus, and last the Carthaginians. These wars were fought within central and southern Italy and resulted in much devastation. A particularly destructive war was the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, Toynbee 1965. Census numbers dropped from a high near 300,000 in 265 BCE to close to 200,000 or even less around 200 BCE for the censuses of 209 and 209 BCE, 194 ROME THEREPUBLICANCYCLE 187. Table 6.3. Socio-political instability in Rome, 350 to 0 BCE. Year event, 342. The last exit of the plebeians, 287 disturbances before Lex Hortensia, 198 to 6 slave rebellions at Setia and Praeneste. Etruria, 135 to 2, First Servile War. 133. Murder of Tiberius Gracchus and his 300 followers, 125. Insurrection at Fregele, 121. Murder of Gaius Gracchus and 3,000 followers, 104 to 1 second, Servile War. 100. Murder of Saturninus and his supporters, 91 to 87. War of the Allies, Social War, 88 to 2 civil war between Marius and Sulla, 82 to 1, Sulla's prescriptions, 78 to 7. Insurrection of Marcus Lepidus, 73 to 1/3 Servile War, Spartacus. 63 Insurrection of Catilina, 52 street rioting in Rome, Milo versus Clodius. 49 to 45 Civil War, Caesar against Pompey and the Pompeians. 44 Assassination of Caesar, 43 Prescriptions of the Second Triumvirate, 43 to 2. Civil War, Brutus and Cassius versus the Second Triumvirate, 41 to 40 Perusian War, Octavian versus the Antonians, 37 to 6 War with Sextus Pompey, 32 to 30 Civil War, Octavian versus Antony. Source: Sorokin, 1937, supplemented by other sources. Table 6.4 Roman census and territory for selected years, circa 330 to 225, an estimated population density. Census territory Pop. Density year BCE, 1,000 individuals, 1,000 square kilometers, individuals per square kilometer. 330, 155.385, 294, 262, 14.0, 56, 280, 287, 17.450, 265, 292, 24.0, 37, 234, 271, 24.0 Tredifier, Tudive Femagalfjords, Tugalfjords, Femoctave, 2 Tredive. Source: Census figures and territory from Brunt, 1971, Tables 1 and 5. Note: assumes that adult males constituted 1/3 of the total free population. CHAPTER 6188. Livy transmits the figure of around 140,000, and for 204, 214,000. Part of this drop was artifactual and reflected the absence of large numbers of Roman soldiers stationed away from Rome and who were therefore not counted in the census, Brunt, 1971. But there is also no question that the Roman citizenry suffered huge casualties. Ward, Heichelheim and Yo, 2003, 131. However, it is logical to assume that the numbers of females and children did not decline to the same extent as those of males of military age. As a result, the census numbers rapidly bounced back to the level of 250,000 in the early 2nd century. Falling population density due to war losses and territorial expansion meant that internal competition for resources ceased to be a factor in Roman politics, until the next stagflation phase, that is. Instead, all efforts of both aristocracy and commoners were directed at the struggle with external enemies. Aristocracy was also severely affected by war losses. For example, at the Battle of Cannae, 216 BCE alone, there were 80 senatorial casualties. Natural attrition and earlier battles also had taken a severe toll, resulting in 97 additional vacancies between 219 and 217, Raaflaub, 1986, 167. In other words, instead of the normal turnover of 10% over these 3 years, almost 60% of the Senate was a blighter, ated. The intense wars of the 3rd century, in which the aristocracy was fighting on the front lines, thus helped to prevent elite overproduction. Once the Second Punic War ended, in 201 BCE, all subsequent Roman wars were fought abroad, that is, outside peninsular Italy. Rome typically had the upper hand in those conflicts, and the casualties were lighter. As a result, the 2nd century saw a period of sustained population growth. The census numbers increased from 258,000 in 1890 to 394,000 to 395,000 in 125 and 114 BCE. The estimated free population of peninsular Italy increased from 2.35 million to 4.25 million. Section 6.1. Between 291, the Roman territory stayed unchanged. Crawford, 1993-46. Which implies that the population density increased by more than 50%. This increase refers only to free citizens, but the population of slaves grew even faster. Archaeological data from southern Etruria also suggest that the popular Taian density increased during this period. The number of settlements in Agave and Tarnus doubled between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, Bintliff and Sponius, 1999. The period after 300 BCE also saw the decline of Etruscan towns and the dispersal of settlements into the countryside, Green 1096, 103. This is a typical pattern, often observed during the expansion phase of the secular cycle. It results from the increased security accompanying the disintegrative-integrative shift and is a sign of population growth as the proportion of the population in urban environments with its negative population growth is reduced. ROMETHEREPUBLICANCYCLE 189. In summary, the expansion phase of the Republican cycle was characterized by 2 periods of population growth. The total number of Roman citizens first doubled between the mid-4th and mid-3rd centuries. However, the territory controlled by the state increased even faster, with the result that the population density actually declined. During the second half of the 3rd century, population numbers declined as a result of a series of wars, culminating in the Second Punic War. Once the Second Punic War was over, in 201, population growth resumed. During the 2nd century, the number of citizens increased by more than 50%. Because the territory directly controlled by Rome was approximately constant during this period, population growth in the 2nd century resulted in an increased population density. 6.3 stagflation, 180 to 130 BCE. Demographic trends in the 2nd century BCE. The century between the tribuneship of Tiberius Gracchus, 133 BCE, and the establishment of the Principate by Augustus in 29 BCE was dominated by persistent domestic strife that twice flared up into protracted and intense civil wars. This period of state collapse and chronic civil warfare, reviewed in section 6.4, has all the earmarks of a classic demographic structural crisis because its onset was preceded by popular immiseration, intense elite competition, and the stagnation of state revenues. Here we review each of these trends in turn. In the late Republic, the economic structure of the Roman polity underwent a deep transformation. Agriculture in the early and Middle Republic was dominated by free landowners who worked small family farms and provided recruits for the legions, assidui. Assidui still outnumbered the landless citizens, proletari, at the end of the 3rd century by about 5 to 1 or even 10 to 1, as estimated in section 7.1. By the late Republic, the numbers of assidui had shrunk to an alarming degree, whereas the numbers of prole. Tari and slaves had experienced massive growth. There is some question about precisely when the transformation took place. Until recently, the consensus view, as put forth in the textbooks, see Ward, Heichelheim, and Yo 2003, held that it began in the late 3rd century. Historians such as Arnold Toynbee, Keith Hopkins, and Peter Brunt have argued that the wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries, and especially the Second Punic War, undermined the relative agricultural stability established by the Licino-Sextian Compromise of 367. Battle casualties inflicted by Hannibal's victories on the Romans were extraordinarily high. According to Polybius, 110,000, although Brunt 1971 thinks such numbers are exaggerated. Moreover, the wars were fought in Peninsula C, HAPTER 1900. Italy and caused widespread destruction of the productive infrastructure. Toynbee 1965, although Toynbee probably exaggerates the persistence of the effect. The Roman censuses reflect the demographic impact of the wars: 292,000 in 264, just before the start of the First Punic War, and 214,000 in 203, near the end of the Second Punic War. Those soldiers who survived the wars returned to find their farms run down and burdened by debts incurred to support their families. Not a few had been seized for debt or simply taken over by some larger neighbour. Ward, Heichelheim, and Yo 2003, 131. Meanwhile, the elites, who got the biggest share of the profits from the overseas conquests, invested the bulk of their capital in land. Large-scale capital-intensive operations, latifundia, specialized in producing high-value products for the market. The transformation of a subsistence economy which had previously produced only a small surplus into a market economy which produced and consumed a large surplus was achieved by increasing the productivity of agricultural labor on larger farms. Fewer men produced more food. Underemployed smallholders were expelled from their plots and replaced by a smaller number of slaves. The rich bought up their land or took possession of it by violence. They reorganized small holdings into larger and more profitable farms in order to compete with other nobles, to increase return on their investment in land and slaves, and to exploit their slaves more effectively. The mass eviction of the poor by the rich underlay the political conflicts and civil wars of the last century of the Roman Republic. Hopkins, 1978, 2-5. This conventional explanation for the late Republican transformation was summarized pithily, if unsympathetically, by Jongman, 2003, 105, as follows. When larger and larger Roman armies began to fight longer and longer wars in more and more distant lands, military service became increasingly burdensome to ordinary peasant citizens, the traditional backbone of the legions. As a result, many lost their land to ever more powerful rich and left to increase the number of the urban poor. The rich, grown richer from the spoils of conquering the world, acquired the large estates through the purchase and occupation, legal or otherwise, of public and private land. To work the land, they used the ever-increasing numbers of slaves captured in Rome's wars of expansion. Recently, the consensus view was severely criticized by Jongman, 2003, Rosenstein, 2004, and De Licht, 2004-2007. In a wide-ranging and closely reasoned book, Rosenstein argues that Rome's citizen soldiers were not victims of their city's imperial adventures, but willing and often enthusiastic participants. Rosenstein 2004-60. Their enthusiasm waned only after Rome THEREPUBLICANCYCLE 191. The mid-2nd century, combat in Spain since 153 had been hard and unprofitable. Defeats were frequent, and the loss of life there often heavy. Conscripts were notoriously reluctant to go, just as Plutarch reports, and morale in the army was at rock bottom. Rosenstein, 2004, 53. Furthermore, new plantation agriculture appears in the literary and archaeological record in the mid-2nd century at the earliest, and it became widespread only during the age of Sulla, Rosenstein, 2004-6. Thus, several generations elapsed between the period of heaviest war casualties and the rise of latifundia, throwing doubt on a direct causal link between the two processes. Using demographic models and the calculus of agrarian economy, Rosenstein showed that most families of Roman smallholders could readily spare the labor of young males without going under. In fact, the main problem facing the Roman countryside during the 2nd century, and many other agrarian societies during the appropriate phase of the secular cycle, must have been rural underemployment, rather than lack of labor to work the fields. Rosenstein stands the consensus view on its head, and argues that an increasing number of smallholders and the prevalence of partible inheritance among them offer an attractive alternative to the conventional AC. Counts of the origins of the agrarian crisis that Gracchus sought to solve. Rosenstein, 2004, 155. The great many deaths of young Roman males between 218 and the last third or so of the 2nd century are very likely to have made a significant contribution to the dramatic rise in population that took place following the defeat of Hannibal. As the population multiplied and parents divided smaller and smaller inheritances among their children, the number of citizens whose wealth placed them among the proletarii may well have been increasing. By 133, therefore, Roman warfare in the years since Hannibal's invasion had not only contributed to a rapidly rising population, but also produced a body of smallholders in the lowest census classes that was, overall, significantly poorer than their 3rd century counterparts, and without much hope of improving their lot through their own efforts. And with the end of colonization of Italy after 1811, the Senate closed this safety valve for families unable to establish all their children on new farms. Rosenstein 154-64 Passim. As we see it, Rosenstein advances an essentially demographic structural argument. There is no question that the protracted series of wars had a great effect on Roman population dynamics, and must be taken into account. However, its effect is the opposite of the one postulated by the consensus view. It did not cause the civil wars of the 1st century, but rather chapter 6192 postponed the day of reckoning until then, thus the unusually long expansine phase of the Republican cycle. The end of the Second Punic War introduced a century-long period of internal peace to peninsular Italy, since all succeeding conflicts were moved to the expanding frontier of the Roman Empire. Productive infrastructure damaged by the conflict was rapidly restored, creating conditions for rapid population growth. Growth was somewhat inhibited at first by high casualties in the external wars, and until 1811 by colonization of the Po Valley. Between 203 and 124 population numbers almost doubled, while the territory of Ager Romanus stayed constant between 188 and 85 BCE at 55,000 kilometers. 2. Baloch, 1964, 101-2. Such a massive increase in population must have had the usual demographic structural consequences for peasant economic conditions. In the Roman case, the effects of population growth were exacerbated by the universal pattern of equal division of property among the heirs. After 2 or 3 generations of rapid population growth, property fragmentation must have reached the point where each heir's share was grossly insufficient for feeding the family. Some, former assidui, undoubtedly sold their land to elites, flush with the spoils of the Rome's conquests, and eager to invest their fortune in land. Others tried to go on, ran up unsustainable debt levels, and also lost their land. The end result of this process was diminution of the class of small landowners, accompanied by the growth of landless proletarii and slaves, although the growth of slave numbers was not dominated by demographic processes internal to Italy but was a result of external conquests. Many of the landless citizens moved to Rome, while others probably rented land from the elite landowners. Jongman, 2003, for example, argues that the degree of latifundization during the late Republic is overestimated. Population growth brought about the usual Malthusian developments. After a period relatively free of epidemics during the later 4th and 3rd centuries, the disease frequency increased again during the 2nd century, Duncan Jones, 1996. Epidemics also became more severe. For example, Orosius claimed that the plague of 142 killed so many undertakers that the corpses were left to rot in their beds, eventually making Rome uninhabitable. Duncan Jones, 1996, for 113. Economic trends. We have extremely scanty information about the price and wage dynamics under the Republic, but what there is suggests that the century between 150 and 50 BCE saw a substantial inflation. Probably the best indicator is the military wages. In the late 3rd century BCE, a legionnaire received a daily pay of 3 asses per diem, or the cost of a modius of wheat. Hal, ROME, THEREPUBLICANCY, CLE 193. This daily amount translates into an annual pay of 108 denarii, using a year of 360 days and 10 asses per denarius. The amount of 360 modii equals 2.34 tons of wheat, or about 10 annual rations. Quite a generous salary for a pre-industrial society. In 141, the denarius was re-evaluated at 16 asses, and the legionnaire's pay was set at 5 asses per diem, probably again reflecting the price of a modius of wheat, a quarter bushel, at that time. Thus, the annual pay increased to only 112.5 denarii, in nominal terms staying constant in real terms, which suggest very mild inflation up to this point. The next time military pay was increased was a century later by Caesar in 46, to 225 denarii per annum, or 2.5 HS sesterces per diem. This doubling also probably reflects the price of wheat, since the fair price of wheat according to Cicero is 2.5 HS per modius. See the discussion in Duncan Jones, 1990, 147-49. The Republic did not increase military wages between 141 and 46, instead compensating men with triumph, foul donatives, and promises of land. Hall, 1996:213. What probably happened, therefore, was that the price of wheat at least doubled between 141 and the onset of the civil wars in 91. We know that grain prices had already increased by the Gracchus times. The Lex Frumentaria of Gaius Gracchus, for example, provided for the state-supported sale of wheat to citizens at the price of 6.33 asses per modius, or 1.6 HS per modius, which was below the average market price. Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 1160. In fact, it is likely that the price of wheat increased even more than by a factor of 2 during the chaotic years of the civil wars, before it came down to the level of 2.5 HS per modius after political stability was established. Thus, the real pay of a legionnaire must have gone through the following dynamics, starting high at 2.34 tons of grain per annum in 141, collapsing by a factor of 2 or more in 90 to 71, and then regaining the 141 level by 10 to 9 BCE, profiting from the decline of wheat prices under the Principate. The daily wage of an unskilled labourer apparently increased between the 2nd and 1st century BC. According to Cato, it was 2 HS per day, while in Cicero's day, a century later, it was 3 HS per day. Wells, 1992, 186. Another striking transformation of late Republican Italy was the growth of industry, trade, and urbanization. Thus, the population of Rome tripled during the 2nd century from roughly 150,000 to 450,000, Chandler, 1987. An alternative estimate has the population of Rome increasing from 150,000 in 200 BCE to 375,000 in 100 BCE, and then to 600,000 in 100 CE, 50 BCE, Scheidel, 2004-14. Two main factors drove this process. First, Rome's successful conquest transformed it into the capital of a Mediterranean empire. Wealth from the sale of booty, war indemnity, tribute, and state-owned mines poured into Rome, first enriching the elites and then trickling down to benefit the tradesmen and artisans, who catered to the elites' needs. Expanded urban employment attracted rural immigrants. Second, increased numbers of peasants lacking land to feed themselves and CHAPTER 6194. Their families migrated to the cities in search of economic opportunities. Thus, urbanization was driven by both pull and push forces, which parallels the English and French cases discussed in previous chapters. Toward the end of the 2nd century, however, push apparently overwhelmed pull. There were not enough jobs for the immigrants to Rome, and housing was in high demand, driving rents up. Crime increased. The urban poor became increasingly discontented. Ward, Heichelheim, and Yo, 2003, 135. Elite dynamics. The most striking development of the 2nd century BCE was the increase in both the numbers and wealth of the Roman elites. As we saw in the previous section, archaeological data confirm the traditional view of simple lifestyles of early republican elites. However, after around 300 BCE, we start seeing signs that elite consumption levels were beginning to increase. It is most clear in the curve of new temple building, figure 6.2. After a long spell with very few temples built in the later 5th and 4th centuries, temple building activity began increasing around 300 and continued to increase throughout the 3rd century BCE, reaching a peak in the 2nd. It may be argued that during the Republic, temple building activity reflected success at war rather than elite consumption. New temples were often vowed by army commanders before a critical battle, and a significant portion of building expenses came from the booty. However, other indicators of aristocratic conspicuous consumption point in the same direction. Thus, beginning in the late 4th century, the number of monumental tombs in Etruria suddenly began increasing. Barker and Rasmussen, 1998, 286. On the basis of his analysis of economic data for more than 200 Roman senators, Schatzman, 1975, concluded that their expenses rose steadily after the end of the Second Punic War, 201 BCE, and reached a peak during the period after Sulla retired in 79 BCE. It is apparent that Rome's wars in the East caused a rise in the standard of living. Once the senators discovered the refined and sophisticated tastes of the Hellenic world, they were not slow to imitate what they found and to increase their private outlay. This process, begun in the first half of the 2nd century, reached extravagant heights in the 1st. Our information suggests it was consulars and nobles who were chiefly responsible for this extravagance, but the entire senatorial class increased its cost of living. Schatzman, 1975, 98. The scale of private fortunes during the 1st century reached astronomical proportions. Of the senators for whom property values are known, 5 individuals possessed fortunes that were greater than 100 million HS. Rome Therer Epubili Cancyc Lee, 195. Lucius Balbius, Marcus Crassus, Lucius Lucullus, Pompey, and Lucius Tarius Rufus, Schatzman, 1975-35. To convert these numbers into silver equivalents, 1 HS is approximately equal to 1 gram S. In other words, 100 million HS is roughly equivalent to 100 tons of silver. Ordinary senators had fortunes of several million sesterces. For example, M. Cicero had 13 million. Cicero also wrote that a rich Roman needed an income of 100,000 to 600,000 sestertii per year. Since total fortunes and annual incomes in pre-industrial societies usually relate in a ratio of 20 to 12 to 1, these income figures imply fortunes of 1.2 to 12 million HS. What is interesting is that there apparently was an increase in the scale of senatorial fortunes between the 2nd and 1st centuries. Thus, L. Aemilius Paulus, who put an end to the kingdom of Macedon in 167, left a fortune of only 1.44 million HS at his death, Crawford, 1993-75. This is an order of magnitude less than average fortunes a century later. At the same time that the rich were getting richer, the poor were becoming progressively poorer. The capital wealth needed to qualify a man for the first classis was probably lowered from 120,000 to 100,000 asses, Crawford, 1993-79, in order to counteract the effect of increasing impoverishment of the assidui. The lower boundary qualifying men as assidui, 5th class, was once 11,000 asses, Crawford, 1993-97. It was lowered to 4,000 during the first half of the 2nd century, then to 1,500 by 141, and eventually abolished altogether. In 107, Marius enrolled capitat censi, those without property who were simply listed in the census, proletarii, Crawford, 1993, 125. The numerical decline in the stratum of self-supporting freeholder, assiduous, is also manifested in the declining proportion of Roman citizens versus allies in Roman armies. By the end of the 2nd century, the ratio of allies to Romans was 2 to 1, Crawford, 1993-128. Intralite competition. To gain an insight into the elite numerical dynamics during this period, we turn to the study by Hopkins and Burton, Hopkins, 1983, Chapter 2. This study focused on the top stratum of the Roman hierarchy, the consuls, the chief elected officials of the Roman Republic. Every year, 2 consuls were elected, so that over the period of a typical generation of 30 years, there could be a maximum of 60 consuls. Because the same individual was sometimes elected more than once, the actual number usually fluctuated between 50 and 60. These 50 to 60 men at the top of the Roman hierarchy at any given time were relatively well documented, and provide us with an excellent sample with which to investigate Roman elite dynamics. The traditional view among historians holds that the Roman elites were dominated by a small circle of noble families. During the century preceding the year of Tiberius Gracchus's tribunate, 133 BCE, 10 clans, gentes, CHAPTER 696, supplied 50% of all consuls, and another 11 clans supplied an additional 30%, De Sanctis, cited in Toynbee, 1965. Among the patrician clans, Corneli supplied 23 consuls, Aemili 11, and Fabii and Postumi 7 each. Among the plebeians, Fulvi produced 10 consuls, Marcelli 9, and Semproni 8. Thus, a small proportion, 5%, of more than 400 gentes that produced magistrates of any kind, consuls, praetors, curule aediles, etc., dominated the top stratum of the Roman state. Hopkins and Burton argued on the basis of their analysis that the degree of power concentration in the hands of a few families was exaggerated. They pointed out that 1/3 of all consuls elected in the period 250 to 50 BCE had no direct consular ancestor in the previous 3 generations. Only 1/3 of all consuls had a consular son, and less than 1/4 managed to transmit their consular status to a grandson. On the basis of their results, Hopkins and Burton argued that, contrary to the traditional view, there was a continuous movement into and out of the Roman political elite during the last 2 centuries of the Republic. Hopkins, 1983-32. There is no particular contradiction between the observation by Hopkins and Burton that 65% of consuls had a direct consular ances, tor, and that by De Sanctis that 21 clans produced 80% of the consuls. First, the 2 numbers are based on different time periods, 250 to 50 versus 233 minus 133. Second, a clan usually consisted of several, sometimes many, families. Both sets of numbers thus indicate a strong but not absolute control of the political power by the established families. What is more puzzling is the low probability of transmitting consular status to descendants, 32% to a son and 24% to a grandson. Such a strong anisotropy in consular ascendants versus descendants actually suggests that the consular stratum was undergoing some interesting dynamics during this period. Fortunately, Hopkins and Burton presented their data broken down by 30-year periods, roughly generations, which allows us to examine the temporal changes in the probability of status transmittal during 250 to 50 BCE, data from Hopkins 1983, tables 2.2 and 2.4. The solid line indicates the proportion of consuls that had either a consular father or a consular grandfather. It is important to add these 2 categories together because elite families often had to skip generations because their resources were depleted by vigorous and costly political activity necessary for achieving consulship. What we see is that the proportion of consuls with consular ascendants increased from 45% in 249 to 220 to 64% in 139 to 110. In other words, the nobles actually tightened their grip on consular power toward the Gracchian period. The same dynamic is observed ROME, THERE, PUBLICANCYCLE 197. Figure 6.6 Inheritance of consular status 250 to 50 BCE. A. 2-generation transmission of consular status. Consuls with a consular father and or grandfather, solid line, and consular grandsons of consuls, dashed line. B. Single-generation transmission. Consuls with consular fathers, solid line, and consuls with consular sons, dashed line. Hopkins and Burton data from Hopkins, 1983, Table 2.2, Table 2.4. When looking at consuls with consular fathers, from 30 to 38% before 170 to 58% in 139 to 110, figure 6.6b, solid line. The second, dashed line, in figure 6.6a, indicates the proportion of consuls that had a consular grandson. This curve, in contrast to the solid one, does not increase with time. It fluctuates around 30% until 169 to 140 BCE, then suddenly drops to 13% during 139 to 110, figure 6.6a. Other measures of status transmittal experience similar drops at the same time. The proportion of consuls with consular sons dropped from 38 per CHAPT-ER 6198. Cent to 27%, figure 6.6b, dashed line, while the proportion of consular great-grandsons dropped from 27% to 10%. Thus, paradoxically, at the same time that the nobles were tightening their grip on the consulate, their ability to transmit their status to their descendants decreased. The only possible explanation of this dynamic is that the pool of aspirants for consular positions was steadily expanding during the second century. As increased numbers of nobles contended for the same maximum of 60 consular positions per generation, intra-elite competition increased and the probability of losing grew. This trend led first to the choking off of upward mobility and the growing domination of the consulate by the nobles, followed by intensifying competition among their descendants. Another set of numbers calculated by Hopkins and Burton, Hopkins 1983, Table 2.7, supports this interpretation. They looked into the ability by the inner elite, that is, consuls with both consul fathers and grandfathers, to produce heirs that would become either consuls or praetors. During the second half of the 3rd century, each member of the inner elite produced on average 1.25 consular or praetorian sons. Since this number is greater than 1, the inner elite was actually expanding in numerical terms. Half a century later, the average dropped below 1 to 0.83, and for the period of 139 to 80 is declined to half of its initial value, 0.63. Yet another look at the same pattern is provided by comparing the asymmetry between the correlation of consular status among generations forward and backward in time. Hopkins and Burton noted that on average during the studied period, 40% of consuls had fathers that were also consuls, while only 32% had sons who were also consuls. In a stable situation in which elites replace themselves without either deficit or sur. Plus, these two statistics should be the same. The data, however, suggest there was about a 25% surplus elite production in Rome per generation during this period. This conclusion follows from the observation that 32% of consuls were consular fathers, that is, consuls who had consular sons, and 40% were consular sons, that is, consuls who had consular fathers. Therefore, each consular father produced on average 1.25 consular sons. Since the total number of consular positions was limited, an extra 20%, 0.25 divided by 1.25, of consular aspirants had to be frustrated in their ambitions to obtain a consulship than would be the case under stable conditions, and they and their descendants would have to suffer downward mobility into mere senators. In actuality, the numbers averaged over the whole period hide fairly dramatic fluctuations in the consular father-son ratio. Plotting the proportions of consular fathers and consular sons by time period, we observe that, until the middle of the 2nd century, the two curves fluctuate at a roughly the same level, figure 6.6b. In fact, during the generation of 194 to 170, the one ROME, THERE, PUBL, ICANCYCLE 199. Following the severe pruning of the elites during the Hannibalic War, the proportion of consuls with consular fathers dipped to a mere 30%, while the proportion of consuls with consular sons stayed at 38%, suggesting that intra-elite competition for consular status was greatly reduced during this period. By contrast, during the Gratian period, 139 to 110, the proportion of consuls with consular fathers shot up to 57%, while the proportion of consuls with consular sons dropped to less than half of it, 27%, figure 6.6b. As a result, the rate of elite overproduction peaked right before the century-long period of socio-political instability of the late Republic. The peak of intra-elite competition fell within the next generation, roughly the period from the time of the Gracchi to the Social War. State finances. From 146 to 91 BCE, Roman finances were relatively healthy. In 157 BCE, the treasury reserve was built up to 72 million HS, Harl 1996-44, and on the eve of the social war it was 80 million HS, Harl 1996-44, 1996-50. This equilibrium, however, turned out to be fragile, and the treasury reserve was rapidly consumed by the social war. In fact, it looks like one long-term consequence of the social war was that it destroyed the fiscal equilibrium of the late Republic. Increased financial difficulties after 91 are indicated by the debasement of the denarius to 95% silver content, Harl 1996:50. Furthermore, the state ceased to pay the soldiers. The treasury was empty in 89, for the first time since 213-12, during the darkest days of the Second Punic War, Crawford 1974, 640. After the end of the war, the financial situation was so desperate that the Senate in 88 melted sacred treasures in order to finance Sulla's war in the East. This expedient yielded some 9,000 pounds of gold, Harl 1996:50, equivalent to 43.2 million HS, Crawford 1974:637. The looting of temple treasuries was also employed by Sulla and his allies during the civil war of 83-82. Once Sulla was in power and internal stability was re-established, however, Sulla managed to get state finances in order. Thus, in 81, Sulla restored the denarius to purity, 98% silver. A big factor in Sulla's fiscal success was his victories in the East. He gained from Mithridates an indemnity of 2,000 or 3,000 talents and fined the cities of Asia for 5 years of back taxes, amounting to 20,000 talents, Harl 1996-51, or 480 million HS. Amazingly, however, these huge treasures were immediately spent, and money shortages continued throughout the 70s. Sulla instituted new taxes and passed legislation authorizing the sale of Alga Publicus, Crawford 1974, 638. During the 70s, at the peak of fighting in Spain against Sertorius, the denarius suffered another debasement to 96 to 97% silver, Harl 1996:54. CHAPTER 6-200. The basis for the solution of Rome's fiscal difficulties was laid by Pompey, who reorganized Spain and the eastern provinces so that taxation replaced predatory plundering, Harl 1996-54. As a result of Pompey's reorganization, Rome's revenues quadrupled. See Table 6.2. The tribute from Gaul, conquered by Caesar, increased the total to 380 million HS. These revenues allowed the Republic to amass a great reserve that included 15,000 bars of gold, although we do not know how much a bar weighed, Crawford 1974, 639. The reserve, however, was seized and immediately spent by Caesar in 49. A year later, Caesar was short of bullion and was forced to lower the standard of his denarius to 95 to 96% fine, Harl 1996-55. What we see is recurring cycles of feast followed by famine. The cycle was repeated after the assassination of Caesar. In 44, there was a Suri reserve of 700 million HS, which was immediately squandered by Caesar's successors in their internecine wars, Harl 1996-56. During 44 to 42, the triumvirs again had to debase the denarius to 95 to 96% silver, and by 31 the denarius minted by Mark Antony had declined to 92% fineness, Harl 1996.59. Meanwhile, Octavian was able to increase the pureness of the denarius that he struck. In the Augustan period, after 27 BCE, the purity of the denarius was restored to 98%, and it stayed that way for a century thereafter. Increasing social pressures. Growing misery among the lower strata of the Roman society was matched by the increasing discontent among the elites, although, to be sure, for very different reasons. In the previous section, we discussed the results of the analysis of the top elite stratum, the consular nobility. The data put together by Hopkins and Burton indicate that intralike competition for consular positions greatly intensified toward the Gracchan period. An increasing numbers of aspirants for elite positions meant that even though the established nobility strengthened its grip on the consulships, a high proportion of its descendants were forced down the social ladder. although we lack specific studies, the same dynamic must have affected the senatorial class, because the size of the Senate stayed constant at 300, until it was doubled by Sulla in the early 1st century, then doubled again by Caesar. Working our way down the social hierarchy, we find that the non-senato real elite, the equestrian class, ordo equestris, found it increasingly difficult to achieve senatorial status, and almost impossible to break into the ranks of the consular nobility, Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 137. Social arrangements under the Roman Republic ensured that the knights, equites, would get their share of the profits resulting from Mediterranean conquests. Senators were excluded from state contracts to construct public works, operate state mines, collect taxes, and supply the military. These ROMETHEREPUBLICANCYCLE201. Contracts were undertaken by companies of publicani, who came primarily from the equestrian class, Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 134. During the first half of the 2nd century, a large number of knights who had grown extremely wealthy from their activities as publicani invested their new wealth in more socially prestigious forms, mainly land, and developed aspirations to enter the senatorial class. Thus, the competition for the limited number of senatorial positions was aggravated both by the increasing numbers of aspirants from the established families, resulting from population growth, and by the pressure from the newly rich knights. The elites of the allied Italian polities found themselves in a worse situation than the equestrians, because they were largely excluded from the profits of overseas conquests. As Rome became secure in Italy after the defeat of Hannibal, the Romans increasingly treated their Italian allies as subjects. The allies in turn began demanding citizenship, but the Roman elites obstinately refused to correct this palpable injustice. Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 138. Actually, the Roman ruling class, faced with increasing competition from locally grown elite aspirants, was understandably not eager to add to it by admitting the Italian elites to citizenship. At the same time that popular misery and intra-elite competition were growing, state revenues stagnated. Table 6.2. What was worse, by the mid-deal of the 2nd century, the Romans had begun running out of wealthy civilized states to conquer. After the destruction of Carthage and Corinth in 146, there were no profitable wars until the conquests of Pompey and Caesar almost a century later. Instead, Rome had to deal with an exhausting and costly suppression of primitive tribesmen, as in Spain, pirates, slave rebellions, and a series of internal wars. As all these trends intensified near the end of the 2nd century, intra-elite competition became increasingly violent. A combination of elite infighting and elite mobilized popular movement and regional rebellions eventually led to a complete collapse of the state. 6.4. The Late Republican Crisis, 130 to 30 BCE. The first symptom of the onset of the disintegrative phase was slave revolts, which began breaking out all over the Roman world in 138 BCE. In Italy, a revolt was suppressed with the crucifixion of over 4,500 slaves at Rome and surrounding towns. An uprising at the great slave market of Delos was put down by force of arms, as was another at the silver mines of Laurium near Athens. In Pergamum, the war of Aristonicus, the bastard son of Eumenes II, and his Stoic sun-state against Rome, 132 to 129 BC, was simply a major revolt of slaves, proletarians, and CHAPTER 202 soldiers. Worst of all was the slave revolt in Sicily, where normal slave thuggery and mugging had swelled into full-scale war about 136 BC, under the leadership of a Syrian slave named Eunice. By vomiting fire and uttering oracles, he was able to persuade his 70,000, some say 250,000 followers that he was Antiochus, the king of the Syrians. Only after several years of hard fighting, the murder of many landlords, and much damage to property, were the Romans able to crush this revolt and extinguish its last sparks in 131 BC. Ward, Heichelheim, and Yeo, 2003, 136. This first servile war was followed by the second, 104 to 101, also in Sicily, and then the third, 73 to 71, led by Spartacus, as well as by lesser revolts in Campania and Apulia, Bradley 1989. Peasant rebellions rarely succeeded in agrarian societies when they were confronted by unified elites, and slave revolts in late Republican Rome were not an exception to this rule. A much more dangerous threat to the state arises when the elites become splintered, and certain factions begin to mobilize popular support to be used in their quest for power. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was a politically ambitious young noble from a very prominent family. His father achieved the pinnacle of political success,